January 9th, 2003. Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Allison Pierce, a 28-year-old speech therapist, locked her office after work, stopped at a gas station for a bottle of milk, and texted her mom, "Lasagna tonight. Don't eat too much before I get there." But she never made it home. That night, neighbors noticed her garage door left wide open, the lights still burning. Her car sat parked in the same spot, purse and phone untouched on the seat, and a faint trail of blood led from the car to the side door, then vanished. Detectives searched for months. Her husband said he'd been watching a movie with a friend. Their stories didn't match. A life insurance policy surfaced, and a single broken plastic fragment stained with blood would later reopen the case years later. 2 decades passed. The house was sold. The trail went cold. Until a summer storm in 2023 unearthed human remains beside the Connedaugwinet Creek, and a necklace engraved with 2 letters, AP. What really happened to Allison Pierce that night in 2003? And if her killer's already behind bars, who moved her body? Subscribe now, and turn on the bell as we uncover the forgotten stories behind America's coldest cases. It was Friday, January 9th, 2003, a date lost to time for most, but not for those who lived through what followed. In Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, winter settled on the city with its usual gray indifference. People hurried home, bundled against the cold, eager for the comfort of family and routine. It was the sort of night when nothing extraordinary was expected to happen. Allison Pierce moved through her rituals without haste. 28 years old, a speech therapist at the local elementary school, she was admired for her patience and the gentle way she coaxed shy words from hesitant children. That Friday, she lingered a bit at her desk, grading homework, jotting notes for Monday. As dusk crept over the empty hallways, she switched off the lights, locked her office, and stepped out into the biting air. The drive home was short. She stopped at a nearby gas station, picking up a bottle of milk, habit more than need. The cashier remembered her later, polite, distant, tired after a long week. Before starting the engine, she sent her mother a text. "Lasagna tonight, Mom. Don't eat too much before I get there." It was a fragment of normalcy, a promise that things were as they always had been. That was the last message Allison ever sent. In the hours that followed, the ordinary unraveled with quiet violence. The garage door at the Pierce home stood open, its fluorescent light casting a yellow pool onto the concrete. A faint trail of dried blood led from the car to the side door, almost invisible, easily overlooked by someone not looking for it. Her car was still parked in the same spot. Her purse and phone, untouched, sat in the passenger seat. The keys were missing. The house was silent. By morning, the story was no longer private grief, but public spectacle. Her husband, Matthew Pierce, called 911 just after sunrise. His voice on the recording was controlled, almost numb. "My wife didn't come home. I don't know where she is." Police arrived to find the garage door still ajar, the light still burning, the cold settling in like a second skin. Inside, nothing appeared disturbed, no forced entry, no obvious struggle. The kitchen counters were clean, the TV was off. The only anomaly was absence, Allison's, total and inexplicable. Neighbors would later recall hearing a sharp, metallic sound from the garage around dusk, but thought nothing of it at the time. A cat, a dropped tool, a moment swallowed by the ordinary. But there is nothing ordinary about a vanishing. As news spread, The first layers of shock and confusion gave way to dread. Allison's family and friends gathered at the house, faces drawn and eyes wide. Her mother, Nancy Pierce, sat in the living room, clutching her daughter's phone, dialing the number again and again, hoping to hear a voice or even a ring. Each call slipped straight to voicemail. "Hi, it's Allison. Leave me a message." It was an echo, a loop that would haunt Nancy for years. Within hours, police cordoned off the property. Crime scene tape fluttered in the winter wind, drawing the gaze of neighbors who watched from behind curtains, whispering theories no one wanted to believe. The media arrived. Cameras, notepads, questions with no answers. Headlines would soon reduce her to a name and a mystery. Local teacher missing. For those closest to Allison, time fractured. Moments stretched and doubled back, replaying what-ifs and if-onlys. The lasagna was never served. Her chair at the table remained empty. In the garage, that faint trail of blood hardened, a mute testimony to violence that had slipped in and out without witnesses. And so began the nightmare, a cold, silent undoing of everything familiar, in a place that once felt safe. What really happened that night would haunt Harrisburg for decades. In the frozen dark, one truth settled over the Pierce home: nothing would ever be the same again. Allison Pierce's world was made of small kindnesses and routine. In East Pennsboro Township, a quiet suburb just outside Harrisburg, she built her life on steady rhythms. Her neighbors described her as gentle, often seen walking home in the afternoons, pausing to help children cross the street, never raising her voice. She lived for her students and her family, pouring energy into lesson plans, therapy sessions, and Sunday dinners with her mother. Her home stood on a cul-de-sac lined with maples, the kind of neighborhood where doors were rarely locked, and people trusted the faces they saw each morning. But beneath the stillness, lives twisted in silent struggle. Allison's husband, Matthew Pierce, was a man shaped by quiet desperation. At 32, he had recently left his job as an IT engineer. The diagnosis of multiple sclerosis had fallen like a shadow across their marriage. Each day was measured in small increments, some days manageable, others not. His world narrowed to the home, to routines that were equal parts comfort and cage. He spent his hours watching television, browsing old forums online, losing himself in nostalgia and minor grievances. The man Allison had married, a planner, a fixer, a dreamer, had faded, replaced by someone more brittle, more uncertain. Their closest friend, Blake Norris, moved easily between their lives. At 29, Blake was restless, caught between a string of odd tech jobs and a stubborn dream of becoming a filmmaker. He was a frequent visitor, his car always parked outside the Pierce's house, carrying stories, equipment, and an enthusiasm that briefly lit up the otherwise quiet evenings. He and Matthew, in recent months, had thrown themselves into making a small amateur horror film. Most of it was filmed in their garage, the same space that would become the focus of the town's darkest questions. They joked about it sometimes, how no one in Harrisburg expected horror in a place like this. No one could have imagined that something filmed for fun would one day reflect a horrifying reality. Behind closed doors, the Pierce house held its own subtle tensions. Allison often came home late, her energy drained by the demands of her work. She tried to be patient, to absorb Matthew's silences, to keep Blake's presence a source of support rather than friction. But cracks widened, imperceptibly at first. Small arguments, hurried apologies, promises that fell flat. They loved each other, or told themselves so, but the ground beneath them was shifting. On the surface, their lives looked stable. They hosted small gatherings, exchanged holiday gifts with neighbors, paid their bills on time. Allison's colleagues noticed nothing unusual. If anything, she seemed overworked, distracted, maybe carrying worries she wouldn't name. Matthew, for his part, hid behind a screen of routine and resignation, rarely venturing out except with Blake by his side. Blake was the outlier, louder, more impulsive, always planning the next project, always borrowing, never quite delivering. There was a sense, in hindsight, that the house was already haunted by invisible dangers. The rooms that once echoed with laughter grew quiet, filled instead with unspoken questions. Allison's students sometimes saw her lost in thought, her attention drifting. Matthew began to talk less and less about the future. Blake spent hours filming and refilming, as if searching for something he couldn't name. When Allison vanished, these details would be dissected by police, media, and neighbors alike. Motives would be scrutinized, every relationship pulled apart, every gesture weighed for hidden meaning. But in the weeks and months before that night, life unfolded in its usual, deliberate pace. One moment indistinguishable from the next, shadows gathering in corners no one thought to look. The truth was that danger had been there all along, waiting for the right night, the right moment to reveal itself. And in East Pennsboro Township, what was once ordinary became a wound that refused to heal, a quiet, relentless echo that would define everyone left behind. The hours following Allison Pierce's disappearance stretched into a quiet, unbroken panic, one that pressed its weight onto everyone who knew her. The previous evening unfolded in fragments, remembered and reassembled by police and family, each detail carrying new and ominous weight. Around 6:45 p.m., a neighbor recalled hearing a sharp, metallic sound coming from the Pierce garage. The noise was sudden, out of place in the stillness of an early winter evening. It echoed briefly between the houses, then faded into silence. No one investigated. In suburbs like East Pennsboro, life was built on trust and routine. The ordinary shielded them from suspicion, from the idea that something terrible could happen in the middle of their quiet street. Inside the house, Matthew Pierce moved through the night as if expecting Allison at any moment to go. He set the table for dinner, reheated leftovers, checked his phone for messages. Blake Norris came over just after 7, his visit unremarkable, a usual part of the Pierce family's routine. They watched a movie, the details later blurred and contradicted in the telling, one claiming it was The Ring, the other The Sixth Sense. Memory became another unreliable witness, clouded by anxiety and time. As the night deepened, the absence grew heavier, settling over the house with a chilling finality. Allison's phone went straight to voicemail. Her friends received no replies to texts or calls. The hours ticked by in mounting unease. At 10:00 p.m., with no sign of her, Matthew finally dialed the police. Responders arrived quickly, headlights cutting across the lawn, red and blue strobes flickering against the windows. They found the garage door wide open, the fluorescent light casting a harsh glare over the concrete floor. Her car was still parked, its engine cold. On the passenger seat sat Allison's purse and phone, strange, untouched, as if waiting for her return. The keys were missing, a detail that felt small and enormous at the same time. A faint smear of dried blood marked the concrete, leading from the car to the side door. The stain was almost invisible at first, but as flashlights swept across the scene, it took on the grim certainty of evidence. The officers followed it to the door, and then nothing. No forced entry, no visible signs of a struggle, no objects out of place, no upturned furniture or broken glass. The silence inside the house was overwhelming, broken only by the low hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the kitchen clock. Neighbors watched from behind curtains, the familiar street transformed into a stage for fear and speculation. They offered up what little they knew, a sound, a shadow, the normalcy of Allison's routines. Some replayed the night in their minds, wondering if they had missed something. A cry, a flash of movement, anything that would make sense of the emptiness that now filled the Pierce house. As police searched, the ordinary became sinister. Every cupboard, every closet, every darkened corner seemed to hide a secret, but nothing explained how a woman could vanish so completely, so cleanly, in the space of a few minutes. The investigation spilled over into the street, officers combing the yard, searching for footprints or fibers, piecing together a timeline that only led to more questions. In the days that followed, the vanishing of Allison Pierce became more than a missing person case. It was a fracture line running through the center of the community. Her face appeared on posters, her name on the lips of newscasters and neighbors alike. Parents locked their doors at night. Children were kept close, and every stranger was watched with new suspicion. Yet, beneath all the official statements and speculative theories, the house on Maple Lane stood as a silent witness. The garage light was turned off, the door finally closed, but the feeling of absence lingered, sharp and cold as winter itself. For those who loved Allison, and for those who barely knew her, it was as if she had been erased, not just from her home, but from the world. The silence of her disappearance left questions that would outlast the search, settling into the bones of the town, refusing to fade with the passing days. And in the quiet after the sirens, Harrisburg learned that even in the safest places, the darkness could come without warning, without reason, and take everything. By sunrise, the disappearance of Allison Pierce had swept across Cumberland County like a silent storm. What began as a private tragedy inside the Pierce home spilled out into the streets, radios, and morning papers. The small, close-knit community of East Pennsboro Township was shaken awake. News anchors recited the basic facts in measured voices, but the sense of dread grew with each broadcast, infecting breakfast tables and workrooms, carried in whispers between neighbors who suddenly saw their world as unfamiliar and unsafe. The first to collapse beneath the weight of it was Allison's mother, Nancy Pierce. She arrived at the house in the early light, clutching her purse, disbelief etched deep in the lines around her eyes. When police repeated the word missing, she crumpled onto the lawn, her sobs absorbed by the cold, hard earth. She refused to leave the property, haunting the porch and garage, unwilling to let go of the hope that Allison might still return. Her voice, when she finally spoke to the local news, carried the hollow ache of someone unmoored from reality. "My daughter would never leave without calling me." It was a mantra that soon echoed through the whole town. As the news spread, volunteers poured in, friends, colleagues, even strangers, gathering at the house, organizing search parties with a quiet, grim resolve. They combed the woods along the Susquehanna River, their flashlights flickering through bare trees, boots crunching over frozen earth. Some fanned out across the highway, passing out flyers to truckers and travelers, holding up photographs of Allison's gentle, open face. Each effort was a kind of ritual, a refusal to accept the finality implied by the word missing. The investigation became a spectacle that consumed daily life, Police cruisers prowled the neighborhood, stopping to question anyone who had seen or heard anything, no matter how small or insignificant. Local businesses hung her missing person flyer in their windows. Allison's colleagues at the school organized vigils, their voices hoarse from shouting her name into the empty fields behind the playground. But as each day ended and the sun dipped below the horizon, the collective optimism began to erode. Fear seeped into every crevice of the town. Parents double-checked their locks and drew their curtains. Children whispered rumors at school, piecing together the horror from snippets of overheard adult conversation. At night, East Pennsboro fell eerily silent, the air thick with suspicion and unease. People who had shared coffee and backyard fences now eyed each other with uncertainty, as if anyone could be hiding secrets behind polite smiles. Nancy Pierce's world became smaller, confined to the ring of candlelight on her kitchen table. Each evening she dialed Allison's number, holding her breath through the empty rings. The line always went to voicemail. "Hi, it's Allison. Leave me a message." Nancy would listen to the recording, sometimes more than once, before finally hanging up, her heart heavier each time. Her daughter's voice, preserved in digital memory, was all she had left to hold on to. In the middle of all this, the house itself became a shrine to loss. The garage door, once just an entrance, now marked the border between before and after. Notes and flowers began to pile up, offerings from a community desperate to do something, anything, to break the spell of helplessness. Candlelight vigils flickered in the cold, drawing neighbors together, their faces somber and illuminated by shared grief. Each flickering flame was a silent plea for answers, a protest against the darkness that had crept in without warning. Yet, as the days stretched into weeks, hope grew brittle. Leads dried up. The search parties dwindled. News vans packed up and left, leaving only the echo of unanswered questions. Allison's absence was no longer an event. It became a presence, a shadow that lingered in the hallways of her home and the hearts of everyone who had ever known her. For Nancy Pierce, the waiting became a ritual of pain and endurance. Each day was another test, another reminder that her world had been split open. She kept the porch light on, just in case, and every night she whispered her daughter's name into the quiet. In the aftermath of panic, fear became the new normal, a quiet, persistent ache that filled the town and refused to let go. In the weeks that followed Allison Pierce's disappearance, the search for answers became an exercise in patience and methodical repetition. Detectives worked late into the night, piecing together a timeline out of camera footage, receipts, and half-remembered testimonies. Each detail was scrutinized, every inconsistency recorded and filed away for later. The case, once driven by hope, turned methodical. Numbers and facts and checklists replacing the feverish urgency of the first days. Allison's movements that final evening were mapped with forensic precision. At 5:30 p.m., she left the elementary school, keys jingling in her hand, a smile and wave to the janitor, her last known gesture on camera. At 6:10 p.m., she appeared in grainy security footage at the local gas station, buying milk. She stood in line, expression unreadable, then exited the store. There was no sign of anyone following her, no hint of threat. At 6:45 p.m., a neighbor heard the metallic sound from the Pierce garage. By 10 o'clock p.m., her husband's voice echoed through the 911 line, the quiet urgency in his words hinting at something more than simple worry. Police turned their attention inward, examining those closest to Allison. Matthew Pierce was the obvious starting point. His life had become a tight spiral of routine and withdrawal since his multiple sclerosis diagnosis. He described the night with careful detail. He'd been at home, he said, watching a movie with Blake Norris. But when pressed, the stories diverged. Matthew insisted they'd watched The Ring. Blake claimed it was the sixth sense. Small, forgettable details in ordinary life, but in the context of a disappearance, they became fissures, openings for suspicion to pour through. The police dug deeper. They searched the house, scouring for anything out of place. The kitchen was untouched. The living room held only the quiet aftermath of another night lost to television. But behind the surface, hidden in drawers and hard drives, investigators began to uncover shadows. A life insurance policy in Allison's name, recently updated, $150,000, a sum both significant and damning. On Matthew's computer, buried in old documents, was a file named Insurance Plan A. Its contents were vague, unfinished, but the implications were chilling. Scenarios and numbers, notes on payouts and claims. No direct admissions, nothing that would hold up in court. Just the suggestion of planning, the shape of motive. Attention shifted to Blake Norris. On the surface, he was a friend, eccentric, a bit unreliable, but never dangerous. He was struggling under a mountain of debt, the result of years spent chasing his filmmaking dreams. His amateur horror movie, filmed in the Pierce garage, took on a new and sinister significance. Police questioned him about his relationship with Matthew, about their late-night projects and long hours spent together. Blake denied everything, but anxiety bled into his voice. Rumors spread quickly, fanned by whispers and headlines. The perfect husband was no longer above suspicion. The loyal friend was seen as an accomplice. Every action, every memory, was replayed in the harsh light of hindsight. The community, once united by grief, fractured under the strain of doubt and distrust. Detectives worked the case with a cold diligence. They compared phone records, mapped out timelines, and analyzed the smallest discrepancies. But each answer only deepened the mystery. There was no evidence of forced entry, no witnesses, no confessions. The trail of dried blood in the garage was matched to Allison, but revealed nothing about what had actually happened that night. As winter settled deeper over Harrisburg, the case slowed, the leads growing thinner, the media attention fading. For Nancy Pierce, hope became a distant memory, replaced by the cold certainty that justice would not come easily. She watched as the people closest to her daughter became suspects, as friends became strangers, and as the town that once felt so safe grew silent and wary. The investigation left scars on the family, on the community, on everyone who touched the case. And beneath it all, the questions remained. What really happened in that garage? Who knew more than they had said? In the stillness of those nights, the answers felt further away than ever, hidden in the spaces between truth and lies, waiting for someone to find them. Time is merciless. As winter loosened its grip on Pennsylvania, the story of Allison Pierce faded from headlines, replaced by newer tragedies and passing scandals. For the investigators, the trail had gone cold. No new leads surfaced, no new evidence was found, and the case file, once thick with notes and photos, sat gathering dust on a forgotten shelf. It was as if the world itself had moved on, leaving behind only the raw ache of loss. 3 months passed without a single breakthrough. Police conducted interviews, re-examined forensic samples, but each attempt circled back to the same dead ends. The neighbors who once eagerly joined the search grew silent, their interest dulled by the slow, grinding passage of time. Allison's disappearance became a ghost story, spoken of in low voices, never far from fear or superstition. But Nancy Pierce refused to surrender to silence. Every year on the anniversary of Allison's vanishing, she held a candlelight vigil in front of the house. She organized them herself, standing by the garage door, sometimes joined by a handful of loyal friends, sometimes alone. Flowers and notes accumulated at the entrance, faded and battered by rain and sun. The same phrase appeared over and over, ink smudged by tears and weather. "We'll find you, Allie." Inside, Nancy lived surrounded by memories that cut as much as they comforted. She kept Allison's room unchanged, a shrine to hope, but also a prison of the past. Each item was preserved in stasis: the framed diploma on the wall, the sweater draped across the bed, the stack of therapy workbooks collecting dust. She could not bring herself to touch them. The house itself became a boundary between the world that had ended and the one that refused to begin. Years crawled by. 5, then 10, 15. The vigil became tradition, an act of resistance against forgetting. As new families moved in and out of the neighborhood, the old stories lingered. Children pointed at the Pierce house on their way to school, repeating fragments of rumor and myth. The adults whispered warnings, their voices tight with fear and exhaustion. For those who remembered, the house was more than a home. It was a scar that never healed. Inside the police department, the file remained open but stagnant. New detectives reviewed it out of obligation, reading the pages as if looking for an answer that had simply been missed, hidden in plain sight. But there was nothing. The blood in the garage, the missing keys, the silence in the phone records, all were markers of a crime that left no witness and, in the end, no hope. Matthew Pierce eventually sold the house and moved away. He tried to build a new life somewhere anonymity was possible, but suspicion followed him like a shadow. He rarely spoke to reporters, avoided old friends, and rebuilt his routines brick by brick, as if the simple act of surviving could wash away what had been lost. Blake Norris drifted through jobs and towns, his own dreams ruined by the weight of suspicion and gossip. Both men denied involvement, yet both lived with the burden of being remembered for what might have happened, not for what was ever proven. Nancy's world shrank as years slipped by. She marked each birthday, each holiday, alone or with whoever still cared enough to come. She filled notebooks with letters to her daughter, words that would never be answered, a conversation frozen in time. Each note was a plea to the universe, a refusal to let go no matter how much the world insisted she must. For Harrisburg, the Pierce house stood as a quiet testament to unresolved grief. Paint peeled, new owners came and went, but the shadow remained. It was a warning and a question. How could someone simply vanish? The absence was its own kind of presence, an unhealed wound at the heart of the community. The cold years passed, and the story became memory, faded, but never erased. Underneath the slow, unyielding passage of time, the town waited for an answer, for justice, for Allison. In the spring of 2019, after more than 15 years of silence, the case file of Allison Pierce was quietly reassigned. It was the kind of administrative shuffle that rarely changed anything, but this time, It found a pair of eyes that refused to skim the surface. Kathleen Myers, a young investigator barely in her 30s, was new to cold cases, still believing that persistence might loosen the grip of time. She worked alone, methodically unpacking boxes left untouched since the early 2000s. Faded reports, sealed envelopes, brittle evidence bags. Each item was a remnant of urgency now buried under layers of defeat. For months, Kathleen traced old leads, interviewed retired detectives, and reread statements so many times the words blurred. But she was searching for what others had missed. A small mistake, a forgotten clue, some artifact that didn't belong. Among the evidence, she found it. A plastic fragment, sealed in an evidence bag, marked garage. It was nothing remarkable, just a sliver of broken plastic, stained with a thin line of dried blood. The file noted that it was likely debris from a tool or container, logged and then set aside. But Kathleen saw what others hadn't. The bag was incorrectly sealed, the chain of custody incomplete. It was a small oversight, the kind that haunted unsolved cases. She sent the fragment for fresh analysis. Technology had changed, after all. Weeks passed as she waited for results, her own life shrinking to the size of the case file. The phone call, when it came, brought more questions than answers. The blood on the fragment was Allison's, a piece of her story frozen in time. But there was something else. A partial fingerprint, one not catalogued in the original investigation. The lab ran it through their database, and the name that returned was both expected and devastating. Blake Norris. News moved fast, cutting through the years of stillness like a sudden storm. Police arrived at Blake's small apartment in Lancaster County with a warrant and questions. They searched every inch, moving slowly, methodically, looking for something that might finally pull the truth into the open. In the back of a closet, hidden among boxes of old film equipment, they found an old mini DV tape. It was labeled in hurried scrawl, "Test footage." Investigators watched the video in silence. The footage was grainy, the color faded with age. At first, it looked like any other amateur horror film. Shaky camera work, improvised lighting, familiar voices half laughing, half serious. Then the scene shifted. A woman appeared in a garage, her features obscured by the low quality, but her posture and hair unmistakable. The scenario was uncomfortably close to what had happened all those years ago. An attack staged in almost clinical detail, every movement mirrored in the evidence left behind. For a moment, it felt unreal, a grotesque rehearsal. But as the tape played on, the laughter faded. The screams were not theatrical. The panic felt real. The discovery changed everything. It was not simply art. It was perhaps a confession, captured by accident, left behind for years, waiting for the right pair of eyes. Blake Norris was brought in for questioning, his world contracting to a windowless room and the relentless ticking of a clock. Outside, the news spread through Harrisburg, a cold wind stirring the embers of old fears. For Nancy Pierce, the hope she had tried to extinguish was rekindled with a cruel ferocity. The town that had grown used to silence now buzzed with rumor and dread, each new headline another reminder that justice was neither quick nor merciful. Inside the police station, the questions multiplied. Why had the tape been kept? What was real and what was performance? And if this was a confession, where did it end, on film or in the reality that had haunted the Pierce family for so many years? As the investigation reopened, the wounds did too. The promise of answers brought relief but also new pain. In Harrisburg, old suspicions returned to life. casting long shadows across homes that had just begun to heal. The story was no longer just about loss. It was about betrayal and the strange, terrible ways in which the truth can hide in plain sight, waiting for someone brave enough or desperate enough to see it. Interrogations do not often bring closure. They reveal fractures and secrets, but rarely the simple, whole truth. For Blake Norris, the hours in that interview room stretched on without mercy. Under the fluorescent lights, he seemed smaller than before. His bravado faded, his composure cracked by fatigue and the relentless repetition of questions he could no longer evade. When confronted with the tape, Blake broke. The evidence was undeniable. His fingerprints on the fragment, his voice on the footage, the mirrored details that only someone present could have known. Still, what unraveled in his confession was not the straightforward story detectives had imagined. The truth emerged in halting fragments, each piece both an answer and an accusation. Blake claimed that Matthew Pierce, Allison's husband, had orchestrated the entire plan. According to Blake, Matthew's world had closed in after his multiple sclerosis diagnosis, financial struggles, the loss of purpose, the slow erosion of their marriage. Blake alleged that Matthew approached him with an idea, a staged disappearance, a vanishing act designed to free them both from their burdens. The payout from Allison's life insurance policy was to be the solution. It sounded absurd in the telling, almost desperate, but there were details only an insider could provide. Blake insisted he never meant for anyone to get hurt. The scene was supposed to look real but harmless, a horror film that would fool authorities just long enough for Allison to disappear and then quietly resurface. But things got out of control. On the tape, there were moments when the lines between performance and violence blurred, Allison's fear no longer an act, the struggle too real. In the aftermath, panic took over. Blake described helping to clean up, but refused to say where the body was hidden. That omission haunted the investigation, leaving closure just out of reach. Without Allison's remains, prosecutors faced limits. They charged Blake with conspiracy to commit first-degree murder. He stood trial in 2020, the courtroom crowded with faces from every chapter of Allison's life. Blake's confession was dissected, his motives analyzed, his guilt laid bare. The jury's verdict was swift: life in prison. The weight of a conviction settled over Harrisburg like another winter, heavy and cold. Matthew Pierce, on the other hand, walked free. Despite the evidence of motive, the hints buried in old files and insurance documents, there was no physical proof tying him directly to the crime. He was found not guilty, the technicalities of law creating a rift that facts alone could not bridge. He left the courthouse through a side door, shadowed by reporters, his face unreadable. In the eyes of the law, he was innocent. But in Harrisburg, suspicion lingered, a silent verdict passed by everyone who remembered Allison's gentle presence. For Nancy Pierce, justice was elusive. She attended every hearing, her grief worn down to something sharp and clear. Each night she lit a candle in her window and whispered her daughter's name into the dark. "Justice will only begin when I find my daughter," she told the empty room. The answers she needed, the location of Allison's body, the truth behind every decision, remained hidden, fragments lost to the silence that had always surrounded the case. The story changed Harrisburg. The Pierce home was now a landmark of sorrow. For neighbors, Allison's disappearance was a lesson in the fragility of trust. Old friends drifted apart, families moved away, and the quiet town became a place defined by absence, a warning that the worst things could happen anywhere, to anyone. As months passed, the headlines faded. Only the memories remained. A mother's vigil, a case that would not die, a truth that had come too late to save anything except a measure of certainty. In the cold aftermath, the only thing left was the hope that someday, somewhere, the rest of the story would surface, and the silence would finally, mercifully, be broken. For a time, the story of Allison Pierce slipped beneath the surface of Harrisburg life, reduced to a cautionary tale and a ghostly rumor. The court case was over. The headlines had faded. Blake Norris sat in a prison cell upstate. Matthew Pierce, though acquitted, had left the county. Even Nancy Pierce's nightly vigils drew less attention, their flames flickering behind curtains instead of in public squares. Yet the absence remained, a dull ache that never healed, a wound invisible but ever present. Then, in August of 2023, a summer of heavy rain brought something unexpected. Downpours swept across Cumberland County, saturating the ground and swelling the banks of the Connedogonet Creek. Along the edge of a wooded hillside, the earth began to slide, a slow, muddy collapse that dragged roots, branches, and forgotten debris toward the water. In that tangle, a fisherman casting for catfish saw something strange, pale shapes tangled in tree roots, partly exposed by the flood. He thought it was just driftwood at first, the leftovers of another storm. But as he drew closer, he saw the curve of bone, the delicate line of a jaw, and beside it, a silver chain glinting in the weak sunlight. The necklace was engraved with two letters, A and P, intertwined in looping script. The fisherman called the police, his voice unsteady, describing what he'd found without understanding its meaning. Forensics moved quickly. News of the discovery raced ahead of the investigators, carrying shock and disbelief through Harrisburg once more. The remains were fragile, weathered by years underground, but dental records and DNA left no doubt. They belonged to Allison Pierce. The necklace, one she never took off, was the final confirmation, a piece of her that time and water had failed to erase. For Nancy Pierce, the news brought a strange mix of grief and relief. 20 years of hope and dread ended in a muddy riverbank, with a handful of broken bones and a single piece of jewelry. She was present for the recovery, silent except for the trembling of her hands. There were no words that could make the moment easier, no comfort in knowing that her daughter was finally found, only the blunt, brutal fact of it. But the recovery of Allison's remains did not answer all the questions. In fact, it opened new ones, questions that reignited the investigation and sent a chill through the community. Forensic analysis revealed that the bones had been moved. The shallow grave on the hillside was not a final resting place, but a temporary stop. Marks on the earth, as well as evidence of soil disturbance, suggested the remains had been relocated years after Allison's disappearance, long after Blake Norris was already in prison. This fact cast everything in a different light. If Blake was not the only one involved, if someone else had access to the truth all along, then the mystery was not solved, but merely paused. The police returned to the case files, revisiting old interviews, re-examining timelines, asking again who could have crossed the boundaries of fear and guilt to disturb a secret that had nearly faded with time. The revelation unsettled Harrisburg in ways the original crime never could. If the person responsible was still free, still living among them, what did that mean about safety, about justice? about the possibility of ever truly knowing what happened that night in 2003? Nancy Pierce appeared on local news, her voice soft but clear. Someone else out there knows the truth. It was both a plea and a warning. As summer faded, the town once again braced itself against the unknown. The Pierce house, now owned by strangers, became a place to avoid. Children crossed the street rather than walk past it. At night, old fears stirred behind locked doors, and in the hush of each evening, a single question echoed. If he is still among us, who is he? And what else is buried waiting for another flood, another chance to be seen? The truth, for now, remained just out of reach, like a shadow on water, visible and real, but impossible to hold. The story of Allison Pierce ends in fragments. A faded photograph, a weathered grave, an unfinished letter on a mother's nightstand. The search for truth, after 2 decades, never offered clean answers, only shadows that flickered between memory and regret. For Harrisburg, the case became part of the town's DNA, a constant undertone that changed how people looked at their neighbors and locked their doors. The wounds left by her disappearance and the long, bitter fight for justice marked a generation, becoming legend as much as tragedy. There is a cold honesty in how these stories settle over time. Life does not pause for grief. The world does not bend to longing. As the years passed, families moved, children grew, and the rhythms of ordinary life resumed. But in quiet moments, in the slow walks home, in the hush before sleep, the memory of Allison surfaced again and again. She became not only the lost daughter, the missing wife, but a symbol for everyone who has vanished into silence, for every question that never found its answer. Behind the headlines and court dates, there was always a deeper current, one of betrayal, of love turned into something unrecognizable, of small decisions that spiraled into catastrophe. Allison's kindness and patience, her steady devotion to work and family, seemed at odds with the violence that claimed her. Yet this is how such stories often unfold, not in explosions of rage, but in slow, silent accumulations of resentment, loneliness, and need. For Nancy Pierce, the case closed in form but not in heart. She founded a small charity in her daughter's name, pouring her pain into helping survivors of domestic violence. It was not redemption, but it was purpose, a way to carve meaning out of loss, to prevent the next Allison from slipping away unnoticed. Her grief became a kind of advocacy, her suffering fuel for change. Each year, she spoke at vigils and support groups, her voice steady even as her eyes betrayed the cost. Harrisburg, too, changed in the aftermath. The community grew cautious, the old trust fractured by a crime that seemed to have no end. Even as the police moved on to new cases and the media turned their cameras elsewhere, the lesson remained. Violence does not always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives in quiet gestures, in secrets kept too long, in the words left unspoken. The absence of answers was its own kind of verdict, one that forced the town to carry the weight together. The story of Allison Pierce is, in the end, not unique. It echoes the real case of Randy Trimble, another speech therapist, another life ended by conspiracy and greed. Like Allison, Randy's legacy is shaped not just by her death, but by what came after. The fight for justice, the foundation built in her memory, the survivors given hope in her name. The crimes themselves are singular, but the aftermath, the slow, communal process of healing and remembering, is shared across towns and decades. In the final reckoning, the lesson is as cold and honest as the case itself. Violence begins not with a weapon, but with silence. It grows in the shadows between trust and suspicion, fed by the words people are too afraid or ashamed to say. It is in these spaces that danger finds its shape, slow, invisible, devastating. If there is a call to action in Allison's story, it is a simple one. Listen. Trust your instincts. Reach out for help. Even when the threat feels distant or uncertain, remember that behind every unsolved case, every missing person, there is a web of lives still searching for meaning, for closure, for the truth that might finally set them free. Some wounds never heal, but by speaking their names, by refusing to let the silence win, a measure of justice remains possible. The memory of Allison Pierce endures in the stories told, the lessons learned, and in the hope that the next story will have a different ending.